I saw them before they saw me. 10 American soldiers standing in perfect formation around my father's grave, and I froze at the cemetery gate with wildflowers still clutched in my fist. It had been 3 months since we buried him in the thin spring soil. 3 months since the war ended and left us with nothing but rubble and guilt and the terrible silence of a world that had screamed itself hoarse. The cemetery sat on the eastern edge of Heidelberg, untouched by bombs through some miracle or oversight, a pocket of green among the gray. I came every Sunday with whatever flowers I could find growing wild along the roadside. Because we had no money for proper bouquets, and the florist shops were all shuttered anyway, their windows shattered like everything else. The soldiers stood with their rifles held across their chests, heads bowed, and for a moment I thought I had stumbled into some kind of official ceremony, some American ritual I did not understand. But there were no flags, no photographers, no officers barking orders. Just these 10 men in dusty uniforms standing vigil over a grave marked only by a simple wooden cross and my father's name carved in my own unsteady hand. Klaus Brenner, Arzt, physician. I had wanted to write more, to explain what kind of man he was, but the wood was rough and my knife was dull, and in the end, those 3 words seemed enough. They had to be enough. I should have turned around. I should have left them to whatever strange American custom this was and come back later when the cemetery was empty again. But my feet would not move, and my eyes found the man standing at the head of the formation, taller than the others, with captain's bars on his collar and a face that looked carved from stone. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, lines around his eyes that spoke of too many days squinting into hostile sun. And when he finally lifted his head and saw me standing there, his expression did not change. He simply looked at me, and I looked back, and the wildflowers trembled in my hand. He said something in English to the men behind him, too quiet for me to hear, and they broke formation smoothly, efficiently, spreading out among the graves with the easy discipline of soldiers who had done this 1,000 times before. But the captain stayed where he was, one hand resting on the wooden cross, and I realized with a jolt that ran through my whole body that he was waiting for me, that he had been waiting for me. I made myself walk forward. The gate creaked when I pushed it open, a sound like a question, and my shoes crunched on the gravel path between the graves. Around us, Heidelberg spread out in broken teeth and empty windows, the castle on the hill watching over ruins the way it had watched over prosperity, indifferent to the difference. The Americans had occupied the city for months now, their jeeps rattling through streets too narrow for them, their voices loud in the cafes that were starting to reopen, their chocolate and cigarettes buying smiles from girls who had been taught to hate them. I had not smiled at any Americans. I had barely looked at them. We had lost the war, and my father had died, trying to save people the war was trying to kill, and I did not know how to hold both those truths in my heart at the same time. The captain watched me approach with eyes the color of winter sky, and when I was close enough to see the mud on his boots and the stubble on his jaw, he spoke. His German was hesitant but clear, each word chosen carefully like stones across a river. You are his daughter. Not a question, a statement of fact. I nodded because my voice had disappeared somewhere between the gate and the grave, and he looked down at the cross again, his hand still resting on it, as if drawing strength from the wood. My name is Captain James Holloway. Your father saved my life. The wildflowers slipped from my fingers and scattered across the grave, yellow and white against the dark earth, and I heard myself say something, some small sound that was not quite a word. He continued speaking, his German getting rougher as emotion bled into it, and I watched his mouth form the words, but struggled to make them mean anything. Ambush, December, snow, blood. He had been leading a reconnaissance patrol through the forest east of the city when they were caught in crossfire, Wehrmacht on one side and SS on the other, and in the chaos he had taken shrapnel to the chest and fallen into a drainage ditch half filled with freezing water. His men had retreated, thinking him dead, and he would have been dead if my father had not found him 3 hours later while making his rounds to the field hospitals, pulled him from the water, dragged him to a cellar, and spent the night keeping him alive, with nothing but steady hands and a will that refused to accept another death. "Your father never told me his name," the captain said, and his hand tightened on the cross. "He never told me anything except that I would live if I stayed quiet and let him work. When I woke up the next morning, he was gone. Left me with bandages and morphine and a note in English telling me which direction to walk to find my unit. I have been looking for him since the surrender. Took me 2 months to trace him through the hospital records, and when I found his name, I found his death certificate on the same page. Pneumonia. March 5th, the day after his 53rd birthday. The day I had sat beside his bed in our cold apartment and listened to his breathing get shallower and shallower until it stopped, and I had not cried because there were no tears left in me, just a vast empty space where something essential used to be. He had worked himself to exhaustion during the war, treating anyone who came to his door regardless of uniform or nationality, and his body had simply used itself up, burned through like a candle that had given too much light. "I brought my men to thank him," Captain Holloway said quietly. "I know it does not matter now. I know he cannot hear it. But I needed to come anyway. Needed to stand here and tell him that the life he saved was not wasted. That I went home to my wife and my son because of him. That I am here because he chose mercy when mercy was the most dangerous thing in the world." His voice cracked on the last word, and he turned away sharply, shoulders rigid, and I understood that he was crying or trying not to cry. This American captain who had brought 10 soldiers to stand honor guard over a German grave. Around us, the cemetery was very quiet, except for the sound of birds in the trees, the same birds that had sung through the bombing and the dying, and would go on singing no matter what we did to each other. I looked at my father's cross and thought about the night he had come home with blood on his coat and mud on his knees. The night he had not spoken about, but that had left shadows in his eyes for weeks afterward. I had asked him once if it was hard, saving enemy soldiers, and he had looked at me with infinite weariness and said that there were no enemy soldiers on his operating table, only broken bodies that wanted to go on living. "Thank you," I managed finally, and my voice sounded strange and distant in my own ears. "Thank you for coming. He would have been glad to know you survived." The captain turned back to me, and I saw that his eyes were red but dry, and there was something in his face that I could not name, some question he was trying to ask without words. Behind him, his men had gathered again, quiet and respectful, waiting. The sun was starting to sink toward the western hills, throwing long shadows across the graves, and the air smelled like spring earth and old flowers and the particular emptiness of places where people came to remember the dead. "I visit every Sunday," I heard myself say, and I did not know why I was telling him this. "I bring flowers when I can find them." Captain Holloway nodded slowly, and his hand finally left the cross, falling to his side. "May I come back?" he asked. "May I visit again?" I should have said no. I should have told him that his debt was paid and his conscience was clear and there was no reason for an American officer to keep coming to a German cemetery to stand over a German grave. But I looked at his face and saw my father's hands in it somehow, saw the same impossible choice between what was safe and what was right, and I found myself nodding before I could think better of it. He said something else, something about honor and memory, but I was not really listening anymore because I had noticed the way he looked at me, not with pity or guilt, but with something more complicated, something that made my skin feel too tight and my heart beat too fast. I was 26 years old, and I had forgotten what it felt like to have a man look at me like that, like I was something more than a conquered enemy or a face in the rubble. The war had taken that from me along with everything else. It had taken my girlhood and my future and left me with survivor's guilt and rationed bread and a dead father's medical books that I read at night because they were the only pieces of him I had left. The captain gathered his men with a gesture, and they filed out of the cemetery in pairs, boots crunching on gravel, and I stayed beside the grave and watched them go. He was the last to leave, pausing at the gate to look back at me one more time, and I raised my hand in a small, uncertain wave that felt like a betrayal of something I could not name. Then he was gone, and I was alone again with the wildflowers and the wooden cross, and the knowledge that something had shifted, some door had opened that I would not be able to close. I knelt in the grass and pressed my palm flat against the earth above my father's coffin. The ground was cool and slightly damp, and I imagined I could feel his presence beneath it, patient and unchanging. "What did you start, Papa?" I whispered. "What did you do when you saved him?" But the dead do not answer, and the birds went on singing, and the shadows grew longer across the graves as evening came to the ruined city and found me still kneeling there, trying to understand what it meant that an American captain had come to pay his respects and ask permission to return. I did not know then that he would come back the next Sunday and the Sunday after that. I did not know that in the space of those visits, in the careful conversations beside a wooden cross, something would grow between us that was more dangerous than the war had ever been. I did not know that loving the enemy was the one thing the peace could not forgive, or that my heart had already made a choice my mind had not yet recognized. All I knew, kneeling there in the spring grass with dirt under my fingernails and ache in my chest, was that for the first time since my father died, I did not feel entirely alone, and that terrified me more than anything the war had done. He came back the following Sunday, carrying a bouquet of white roses that must have cost him a fortune on the black market, and I realized with a start that I had been waiting for him. I had told myself all week that he would not return, that his visit had been a one-time gesture of gratitude and nothing more, but some part of me had known better. I had found myself choosing my clothes more carefully that morning, pinning my hair back with the tortoiseshell comb that had been my mother's, and when I saw him coming through the cemetery gate with the roses cradled against his chest like something precious, my heart did a complicated thing that felt like falling and catching myself at the same time. He was alone this time. No formation of soldiers, no rifles, no ceremony. Just a tall man in a clean uniform walking between the graves with the early morning sun behind him, and when he reached my father's plot, he stopped and held out the roses without speaking. I took them because there was nothing else to do, and our fingers brushed in the exchange, and I felt that touch all the way down to my bones. "Good morning," he said in his careful German. "I hope I am not intruding." "You are not intruding," I replied, and I knelt to arrange the roses against the cross, glad for something to do with my hands. "They are beautiful. You did not have to bring anything." "I wanted to," he said simply, and he settled onto the grass beside me with the ease of a man used to making himself comfortable anywhere. Back home we bring flowers to graves. It seemed right. Back home. Virginia, he had told me last week. A farm outside Charlottesville with horses and tobacco fields and a white house his grandfather built. A wife named Margaret who taught piano to the neighbors' children. A son, Thomas, 6 years old, who collected beetles and asked questions about everything. He had shown me a photograph, edges worn soft from handling, and I had looked at the woman's smile and the boy's gap-toothed grin and felt something twist inside me that might have been envy or longing or simple recognition that some people's wars ended differently than others. "Tell me about your father," Captain Holloway said, and his voice was gentle in a way that made my throat tight. The records say he was a physician, but nothing else. What kind of man was he? So I told him. I told him about my father's steady hands and quiet voice, about the way he could walk into a room full of pain and make it smaller just by being there. I told him about the patients who came to our door at all hours, how he never turned anyone away even when we barely had food for ourselves. I told him about the books that lined every wall of our apartment, medical texts in German and Latin and English, and how he used to read to me from them when I was small, not fairy tales, but descriptions of the human body, the elegant machinery of hearts and lungs and nerves. I told him about the war years, about the impossible choices my father had to make, treating wounded soldiers from both armies in our cellar while the city burned above us. and how near the end he had stopped sleeping, stopped eating, just worked until his body gave out because he could not bear to let one more person die if he could prevent it. Captain Holloway listened without interrupting, and when I finally fell silent, he was quiet for a long moment, looking at the cross. "He sounds like he was a good man," he said at last. "The best kind of man. The kind who makes you believe humanity might be worth saving after all." "Yes," I said softly. "He was that." We sat together in the grass, and the morning grew warmer around us, and slowly, carefully, he began to tell me about himself. About growing up on the farm, about studying agriculture at the university before the war started, about the day he enlisted, because it seemed like the only honorable thing to do, even though his wife had begged him not to. About the landing at Normandy and the long push through France, about the friends he lost and the things he saw that he knew would never leave him. About the night my father saved him. The cold and the pain and the strange peace that had come over him when he realized he was going to die. And then the shock of hands pulling him from the water. A voice speaking German telling him to be still, to trust, to live. "I should have hated him," Captain Holloway said, and there was wonder in his voice. "I was trained to hate him. We all were. But when you are bleeding out in a ditch and someone chooses to save you instead of letting you die, all that training just falls away. All I could see was another human being who believed my life mattered, even though I was his enemy, even though saving me could have gotten him killed." "My father believed all lives mattered," I said. "That was his weakness and his strength." "Not a weakness," the captain said firmly. "Never a weakness. It is the only thing that separates us from the monsters." Around us, other people were beginning to arrive at the cemetery. Old women in black, young widows with hollow eyes, children who did not fully understand why they were there. They glanced at us as they passed, at the American uniform and the German girl sitting together, and I saw judgment in their faces, suspicion, anger, barely contained. I wanted to stand up and explain that this was different, that he had known my father, that there was nothing improper happening, but the words would not come, and anyway, I was not sure they would have been true. There was something improper about the way I was starting to feel when I looked at him, something that had nothing to do with gratitude or shared grief and everything to do with the warmth of his voice and the way his eyes softened when he smiled. "I should go," he said, noticing the stares. "I do not want to cause trouble for you." "You are not causing trouble," I lied, and he looked at me, and I knew he heard the lie but chose not to challenge it. "May I come again?" he asked, and it was the same question as last week, but it meant something different now, something more. I hesitated. This was the moment to end it, to thank him politely and tell him his debt was paid, and he should go home to his wife and his son and his farm in Virginia and forget about the German girl in the ruined city. This was the moment to protect myself from whatever was starting to happen between us. But when I opened my mouth, what came out was yes. He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his whole face, and he stood and brushed grass from his uniform and told me he would see me next Sunday. Then he walked away through the graves, and I stayed where I was, watching him go, and feeling the weight of all those disapproving eyes on my back like stones. The week that followed was the longest of my life. I went through the motions of survival, standing in lines for rations, mending clothes that were more patch than original fabric, helping my neighbor Frau Müller clean out her basement so she could rent it to one of the American officers who were taking over all the good housing. Frau Müller was 70 and bitter, and she talked constantly about the old days, before the war, when Germany was proud and strong, and we did not have to bow our heads to foreigners. I listened and said nothing, and thought about Captain Holloway's face when he talked about my father, the reverence in it, the grief. On Wednesday a letter arrived, delivered by an American private who looked barely old enough to shave. The envelope was plain, no military markings, and inside was a single sheet of paper covered in neat handwriting. "Dear Miss Brenner," it began, And I had to sit down because no one had called me Miss in so long. We were all just survivors now, all just hungry, tired people trying to remember how to be human. I wanted to thank you again for allowing me to visit your father's grave. It has meant more to me than I can properly express. I also wanted to ask if you might be willing to meet me somewhere other than the cemetery. I understand this is an unusual request, and you have every right to refuse, but I find myself wanting to know more about you and your life, and it seems wrong to conduct that conversation over your father's resting place. If you are willing, there is a small cafe on Hauptstrasse that serves passable coffee. I could meet you there on Friday afternoon at 3. If you do not come, I will understand. And I will still visit the cemetery on Sunday if you permit it. Respectfully, James Holloway. I read the letter 3 times, and each time my heart beat faster and my hands shook more. And I knew I should burn it, should forget it, should absolutely not go to meet him in a cafe where everyone would see us together. But Friday at 3 found me walking down Hauptstrasse in my best remaining dress, the dark blue one with the white collar that I had not worn since before my father died, and when I pushed open the cafe door and saw Captain Holloway already there, waiting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee in front of him, the look of relief and joy on his face made every bit of risk worthwhile. We talked for 2 hours, about everything and nothing, about books and music and the taste of real chocolate, which neither of us had had in years, about his farm and my father's practice, about his son's fascination with insects and my childhood dream of becoming a teacher. We did not talk about the war, except in glances and silences, the things we had both seen that had no words. And we did not talk about what we were doing. This American captain and this German woman sitting together in a cafe while the city rebuilt itself around us, and the old hatreds tried to find new soil to grow in. When we finally left, the sun was setting and the streets were nearly empty, and he walked me home even though I told him he should not, that my building was in a rough neighborhood and people would talk. He walked me anyway, staying a careful 3 feet away like there was an invisible line between us that neither of us was ready to cross yet. At my door, he said goodnight, and I said goodnight, and we stood there looking at each other in the fading light until I finally turned and went inside before I could do something foolish like invite him up. That night, I lay in my narrow bed and thought about his hands wrapped around the coffee cup, the way he listened when I spoke like every word mattered, the sadness that lived behind his eyes even when he smiled. I thought about his wife and his son waiting for him in Virginia, and I felt shame burn through me hot and sick. What was I doing? What was I thinking? He was married. He was the enemy, or had been, and maybe still was, depending on who you asked. And yet, when I closed my eyes, all I could see was his face across the table. All I could hear was his voice saying my name, Anna, like it was something worth saying carefully. Sunday came again, and we met at the cemetery, as if Friday had never happened. As if we had not sat together for 2 hours learning the shapes of each other's lives. We knelt by my father's grave, and I changed the water in the vase, and we spoke of inconsequential things. But there was a new tension between us now, a current running underneath the polite conversation. When he left, he touched my hand, just briefly, just his fingers brushing my knuckles, and I felt that touch, like electricity. That afternoon, one of my neighbors stopped me on the stairs, Herr Koch from the 3rd floor, and he asked me in a voice full of false concern if I knew I was being watched, if I understood that people were starting to talk about the German girl who met with American officers. He did not say it like a warning. He said it like a threat. I thanked him for his concern and went into my apartment and locked the door and sat on the floor with my back against it, shaking. I knew I should stop seeing Captain Holloway. I knew every meeting was a risk, that in this new Germany we were building, collaboration was almost as bad a crime as what we had done during the war. But when Tuesday came and another letter arrived, asking if I would meet him at the cafe again, I wrote back yes. And when Friday came, I put on the blue dress and walked down Hauptstrasse with my head high, and I told myself I was doing nothing wrong, We were just talking, just two people who had been thrown together by circumstance and history and a dead man's mercy. I told myself that right up until the moment he reached across the table and took my hand, and I did not pull away. His hand was warm and rough with calluses, and when his thumb traced a small circle against my palm, I felt the world narrow down to just that point of contact, just that impossible touch across a cafe table in a city that was learning to hate people like us. I should have pulled away. Every instinct I had been raised with, every lesson the war had burned into me about survival and caution and the price of being careless, all of it screamed at me to take my hand back, to stand up, to leave before this became something I could not undo. But I sat there with my fingers laced through his, and I looked into his winter sky eyes, and I knew with terrible certainty that it was already too late. Whatever this was, it had already become something I could not undo. "We have to be careful," I whispered, and my voice shook. "People are watching, people are talking." "I know," he said, but he did not let go of my hand. "Anna, I know this is impossible. I know I have no right to feel what I am feeling. I am married. I am supposed to go home in 3 months when my tour ends. I am supposed to forget about this place and everyone in it and go back to my life like none of this ever happened. But I cannot stop thinking about you. I cannot stop wanting to know everything about you, and I think you feel it too." He was right, and that made it worse. I did feel it. I felt it every time I saw him. Every time I heard his voice, every time I lay awake at night, replaying our conversations in my head. I had spent the last 5 years learning to feel nothing, teaching myself to be numb so I could survive the daily horror of watching my world burn. And now here was this American captain cracking through all that numbness like spring breaking through frozen ground. It hurt. It terrified me. And I wanted more of it with a hunger that felt like drowning. "This cannot happen," I said, but I still did not pull my hand away. "You have a wife, a son, a life waiting for you. And I am German. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what people will do to me if they think I am collaborating with the occupiers? There are women in this city who had their heads shaved and were paraded through the streets for sleeping with soldiers. Women who were beaten, spat on, driven from their homes. I cannot be one of them. I cannot." "You are not collaborating," James said, and it was the first time he had told me to use his given name, the first time the careful formality between us had cracked. "You are sitting in a cafe having coffee with someone who knew your father. That is all. That is all anyone needs to know. But it was not all, and we both knew it. What we were doing had already gone past coffee and conversation. It had gone past the moment his eyes met mine across my father's grave and something unspoken passed between us. It had gone past friendship or gratitude or any of the safe words we might use to describe it. This was attraction, desire, the dangerous alchemy of two lonely people finding recognition in each other's faces. This was the thing that wars were supposed to make impossible, and here it was happening anyway, stubborn as spring. I finally pulled my hand back, and the loss of contact felt like a small death. "I cannot do this," I said. "I cannot be the woman who falls in love with an American soldier. I cannot betray my country that way. We already lost everything. I cannot lose my dignity, too." "Loving someone is not betrayal," James said quietly. "Your father taught me that. He loved enough to save his enemy's life. That did not make him a traitor. It made him the best of what we could be if we stopped letting hate make our choices for us." "My father is dead," I said, and tears were running down my face now, hot and sudden. "He is dead because he gave everything to everyone and kept nothing for himself. He is dead because mercy is not rewarded in this world, only punished. I will not make his mistake. I will not." James reached across the table again, but stopped short of touching me, his hand hovering in the space between us. "Anna," he said, and my name in his voice undid something in me. "I am not asking you to give everything. I am not asking you to sacrifice yourself. I am only asking if I can see you again, if we can talk, if we can be two people who understand each other in a world that does not understand either of us. That is all. Just that. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand and looked around the cafe at the other customers who were very carefully not looking at us. And I knew they had all heard every word. I knew it would be all over the neighborhood by nightfall, the German girl crying in public with an American officer, and I knew what that would mean for me. But I also knew that if I stood up and walked away now, if I told James I could never see him again, I would be choosing safety over something that felt like the first real thing I had experienced in years. And I was tired of being safe. I was tired of being careful and small and grateful just to be alive. My father had taught me that life was more than survival. He had shown me that by how he lived, right up until he died. And maybe this was my chance to honor that, to choose connection over fear, even if it cost me everything. "Meet me here on Sunday," I said, "after the cemetery, 2:00. The relief on his face was so naked, it hurt to look at. "Thank you," he said. "Anna, thank you." I stood up and left without another word, and I walked home through streets that felt different somehow, sharper and more real. And when I reached my building, Frau Müller was standing by the entrance with her arms crossed and her face set in lines of cold disapproval. She did not say anything. She did not have to. I walked past her with my head up and climbed the 4 flights to my apartment, and I did not let myself cry again until I was safely inside with the door locked. The next days passed in a strange, suspended state, like I was living underwater or in a dream. I went through my routines, but my mind was elsewhere, caught in an endless loop of doubt and desire. I kept remembering the weight of James's hand on mine, the way he looked at me like I was something precious instead of something conquered. I kept hearing Herr Koch's warning about being watched, seeing Frau Müller's judgment, imagining worse. There were stories about what happened to German women who were too friendly with the occupiers, not just shaved heads and public humiliation. Sometimes worse. Sometimes violence that the police would not investigate because everyone agreed the women had brought it on themselves. But there were other stories too. Stories of German women who married American soldiers and went to live in places called Kansas and Ohio and California, who sent letters home describing houses with indoor plumbing and refrigerators and lawns you did not have to share with 10 other families. Stories of escape and second chances and lives remade on the other side of the ocean. I did not let myself think too hard about those stories. James had a wife. James was going home. This thing between us, whatever it was, had an expiration date built into it from the start. Sunday came and I went to the cemetery alone. James did not come that morning, and I told myself it was better this way, that he had changed his mind, that the universe was saving me from myself. I knelt by my father's grave and arranged fresh flowers and tried to pray, but the words would not come. Instead, I found myself talking to my father the way I used to when he was alive, telling him about James, about the impossible situation I was in, asking him what I should do. The dead do not answer, but sometimes you can hear what they would have said anyway, and I heard my father's voice as clearly as if he were kneeling beside me. "Follow your heart, Liebchen. Fear is a poor compass. Love is better, even when it leads you into danger." At 2:00, I walked into the cafe, and James was already there, and when he saw me, his whole face lit up like I was the answer to a question he had been afraid to ask. We sat at the same corner table, and this time when he reached for my hand, I did not hesitate. We talked for hours, until the cafe owner started giving us pointed looks, and we realized we were the last customers left. We talked about childhood and loss, about dreams we had given up, and dreams we still carried. He told me about the farm, about walking the fields at dawn with his father, about the smell of tobacco curing in the barns, and the way morning fog settled in the valleys. He told me about Margaret. His wife and I steeled myself for jealousy, but what I felt instead was a strange, sad compassion. They had married young, he said, before either of them knew who they really were. They loved each other in the careful way of people who had grown up together, but the war had changed him, and she did not know how to reach the man he had become. He did not say he wanted to leave her. He did not say he loved me instead. But the words hung unspoken between us, and we both knew what they were. I told him about my mother, who had died when I was 12, about the hole she left that my father had tried to fill with work and books and the steady practice of mercy. I told him about the war years, about the night the bombs fell so close our windows shattered, and we spent 3 hours in the cellar listening to the city scream. I told him about the patients who came and went through our apartment like ghosts, soldiers from both sides whom my father treated with the same careful attention, and how sometimes I would hear them talking to each other in the night, German and American and British voices mixing in the darkness, finding common ground in pain and fear and the simple animal desire to survive. "We are not so different," James said. "When you strip away the uniforms and the flags, we all bleed the same." "My father believed that," I said. "It killed him, I think, believing it. Or it made his life mean something," James said. "Not everyone gets to die knowing they stood for something true." When we finally left the cafe, it was evening and the streets were emptying, and James walked me home again. But this time, when we reached my building, he did not say goodnight and leave. This time, he followed me inside, up the narrow stairs with their worn treads and peeling paint, up to the 4th floor, where my door stood at the end of a dim hallway. I unlocked it with shaking hands, and we went inside together, and I closed the door behind us, and we stood in my small apartment with its shabby furniture and stacks of my father's books, and we looked at each other in the fading light. "I should not have let you come up," I whispered. "I know," he said. "This is wrong. I know. You have to leave. You have to go back to your barracks and forget about me and go home to your wife in 3 months and never think about this again." "I know," he said again. But he did not move, and neither did I. The space between us felt charged with electricity, with all the things we could not say and could not do and were going to do anyway because we were only human and the heart does not care about timing or propriety or the ruins of the world. He took one step forward and then another, and then his hands were cupping my face, and his forehead was pressed to mine, and we were breathing the same air, standing on the edge of something we both knew would change us forever. "Anna," he said, and it was a question. "Yes," I said, and it was an answer. He kissed me then, soft at first, and then deeper, and I kissed him back with 5 years of loneliness and loss pouring out of me, with all the feeling I had taught myself to suppress flooding back in a rush that left me dizzy. We stumbled backward to the narrow bed against the wall, and we lay down together in the last of the evening light, and we crossed all the lines we had been so careful not to cross, and it felt like coming home and like exile at the same time, like finding something precious and losing it in the same breath. Afterward, we lay tangled together in sheets that smelled like lavender soap, and I traced the scar on his chest where my father's hands had saved his life, and I cried without knowing exactly why. James held me and did not try to make it better with words, and outside the window, Heidelberg settled into night, oblivious to what we had done, to the invisible line we had crossed that there would be no crossing back over. "This changes everything," I said into the darkness. "I know," James said, and his arms tightened around me. "God help me, I know." The knock on my door came 3 days later, hard and insistent, the kind of knock that means trouble. I was alone, thank God, because James had left before dawn the way he always did now, slipping out of my apartment while the city was still dark and the neighbors still asleep. We had been careful, or we thought we had been. But when I opened the door and saw Herr Koch standing there with 2 other men from the building, I knew immediately that careful had not been careful enough. "Fräulein Brenner," Herr Koch said, and his voice was cold and formal. "We need to speak with you. May we come in?" It was not really a question. They pushed past me into my apartment, and I stood there with my hand still on the doorknob, my heart hammering against my ribs. The two other men were younger, harder looking, and I recognized them vaguely from passing in the stairwell. One of them walked straight to my bed and ran his hand over the sheets, still unmade from the night before, and smiled in a way that made my skin crawl. "You have been seen," Herr Koch said, "multiple times. With an American officer. People are talking. People are concerned." "I am allowed to speak with whoever I wish," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There is no law against conversation." "Conversation," the man by my bed repeated, and he laughed, ugly and knowing. "Is that what you call it? We are not fools, Fräulein. We know what happens when German women entertain American soldiers in their apartments. We know what you are." The word he did not say hung in the air between us. Hure, whore, collaborator. All the ugly names they used for women like me, women who had supposedly betrayed their country by lying with the enemy. Never mind that the country had already betrayed us first, had led us into a war that destroyed everything and then collapsed and left us to sort through the rubble. Never mind that love and loneliness did not care about politics. In the new Germany we were trying to build, fraternization was a crime almost as bad as the crimes we had committed during the war. "I want you to leave," I said, and I was proud that my voice did not shake. "You have no right to be in my apartment. You have no right to question me." "We have every right," Herr Koch said. "We are trying to protect what is left of our community. We are trying to preserve some sense of decency and order. And we will not stand by while you spread your legs for the occupiers and shame us all." The words hit me like a physical blow, and I stepped backward, reaching blindly for something to steady myself. The third man, who had been silent until now, moved toward me, and I saw his hands curl into fists, and I understood with sudden clarity that they had not come just to talk. They had come to teach me a lesson, to make an example of me the way they had made examples of other women, other traitors. "Please," I whispered, and I hated the weakness in my voice, but fear had taken over and I could not stop it. "Please do not do this." Herr Koch looked at me with something that might have been pity or might have been contempt, and for a moment I thought he would call off his companions, would decide I was not worth the trouble. But then the man by my bed grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise and pulled me forward, and I screamed. The door burst open, and James was there, still in uniform, his face white with fury, and behind him were two military police officers with their hands on their sidearms. The room froze. The man holding my arm let go and stepped back, and Herr Koch turned to face James with his jaw set in stubborn defiance. "You need to leave," James said, and his voice was deadly calm. "All of you. Right now. Before I have you arrested for assault and breaking and entering." "This is a German matter," Herr Koch said. "It does not concern the American military." "Like hell it does not," James said, and he moved further into the room, placing himself between me and the three men. "Miss Brenner is under my protection. If you touch her again, if you threaten her again, if you so much as look at her the wrong way, I will make sure you spend the next year in a military prison. Do you understand me?" The military police officers stepped forward, and Herr Koch must have seen something in their faces that convinced him, because he nodded stiffly and gestured to his companions. "We are leaving," he said, "but this is not over. People will know what she is, what you both are." They filed out, and James closed the door behind them and locked it, and only then did I let myself collapse. He caught me before I hit the floor and carried me to the bed and held me while I shook, great racking shudders that I could not control. I had been so afraid. I had seen in their eyes what they wanted to do to me, and I knew I had escaped it only by the thinnest margin. If James had not come, if he had not brought the MPs, if he had been even 5 minutes later. "How did you know?" I finally managed to ask. "How did you know to come?" "I saw them enter your building," James said against my hair. I was coming back because I forgot my cap, and I saw them, and something about the way they moved made me uneasy. So I got back up and followed. "You saved me," I said. "Anna," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "This is my fault. If I had stayed away from you, if I had not been so selfish, none of this would have happened. I have put you in danger. I have ruined your life." "No," I said fiercely, pulling back to look at him. "No, you did not ruin anything. They did. This city did. This whole broken world did. You are the only good thing I have had since my father died. You are the only thing that makes me feel human again. Do not take that away from me. Do not tell me I should not have this." He kissed me then, hard and desperate, and I kissed him back with the same desperation, and we clung to each other like drowning people. While outside my apartment, the city went about its business, rebuilding and judging and deciding who deserved mercy and who did not. But something had shifted. We both felt it. The confrontation with Herr Koch had made real what we had been able to ignore before, the fact that this thing between us had consequences that went beyond just the two of us. James's commanding officer would hear about it eventually. The military had strict rules about fraternization, and while they usually looked the other way when it came to casual relationships, this was different. This was an officer conducting an ongoing affair with a German civilian, and there were politics involved, appearances to maintain. If the wrong person complained, James could face disciplinary action. He could be transferred, he could lose rank. And I could face much worse. I could be blacklisted, denied rations, driven from my apartment. I could be hurt or killed by men who believed they were patriots. "We have to stop," I said into James's chest. "We have to end this before it gets worse." "I know," he said. "You have to go home to your wife. You have to forget about me." "I know," he said again, but his arms did not loosen. We stayed like that for a long time, and then James left to make his report to his commanding officer about the incident, and I cleaned my apartment and tried to put my life back in order. But nothing felt right anymore. Everything felt fragile and temporary, like a house of cards that could collapse at any moment. That evening, a different knock came, softer this time. I opened the door to find a woman I had never seen before, middle-aged and tired-looking, with a scarf tied over her hair. She introduced herself as Frau Weber and said she lived 2 streets over, and she had heard about what happened that morning. She wanted me to know that not everyone felt the way Herr Koch did, that some of us understood that the war was over and holding on to hate was only hurting ourselves, that some of us believed people had a right to find happiness wherever they could, even if it was complicated, even if it was with someone we were supposed to consider the enemy. "You have friends," she said simply, "more than you know. We may not speak up in public, but we see you. We see both of you, and we do not judge." After she left, I sat by my window and watched the sun set over the ruined city, and I felt something shift inside me, some small seed of hope taking root. Maybe it was possible. Maybe James and I could find a way through this that did not end in disaster. Maybe love was stronger than hate after all, the way my father had always believed. 2 days later, James came to my apartment with news. His tour had been extended. Instead of going home in 3 months, he would be staying in Germany for at least another year, maybe longer. The army needed experienced officers to help with reconstruction, and he had volunteered for the assignment. He told me this, standing in my doorway, watching my face carefully to see how I would react. "You volunteered?" I repeated. "You chose to stay." "I chose to stay," he confirmed. "Anna, I cannot leave you. I know it is selfish. I know I should go home and try to make my marriage work and be a proper father to my son. But I cannot do it. I cannot get on a boat and sail away and pretend you do not exist. So I am staying. And I want you to know that I am going to write to Margaret. I am going to tell her the truth. I am going to ask for a divorce." The word hung between us, huge and impossible. Divorce. In 1946, it was still scandalous, still rare, still something people whispered about instead of saying out loud. And for him to divorce his wife for a German woman, for someone from the country he had been fighting against just a year ago, it would be catastrophic. His family would disown him. His friends would turn their backs. He would lose everything. "You cannot do that," I said. "James, you cannot." "I already decided," he said. "Anna, I love you. I know I have not said it before. I know I have been afraid to say it, but I love you. And I want to build a life with you. I want to take you back to Virginia when my service is done. I want to show you the farm and introduce you to the horses and teach you to ride. I want to marry you. I want to make this real and legal and permanent. If you will have me." My legs gave out, and I sat down hard on the floor, and he knelt in front of me and took my hands and waited. I thought about everything this would cost him. I thought about Margaret and Thomas and the farm in Virginia that would no longer be his home. I thought about my father and what he would say if he could see us now, and I heard his voice again, clear as a bell. "Follow your heart, Liebchen. Love is better than fear." "Yes," I whispered. "Yes, I will have you." James pulled me into his arms, and we held each other in the doorway of my shabby apartment in a broken city. And for the first time since the war ended, I let myself believe that the future might hold something other than survival. I let myself believe in possibility, in hope, in the stubborn power of love to grow even in the scorched earth where war had tried to kill everything green and living. But the next morning, I woke to find a note slipped under my door, written in crude block letters on cheap paper. It said just 4 words: "Leave, or we will make you." I showed the note to James when he came that evening, and I watched the color drain from his face. We both knew what it meant. Herr Koch and his friends had not given up. They were escalating. The next time they came, they would not stop just because MPs arrived. The next time, they might wait until James was not there. The next time, they might finish what they started. "We need to get you out of this building," James said. "We need to find you somewhere safe." "Where?" I asked. "Where is safe? You think it will be better somewhere else?" "They are everywhere, James. Men like Herr Koch. People who think love is betrayal, and mercy is weakness, and anyone who does not hate the way they hate must be punished. Where can I go that they will not find me?" He did not have an answer, and we sat together in the gathering darkness and tried to figure out how to survive in a world that did not want us to be happy. Outside my window, Heidelberg rebuilt itself stone by stone. But the hatred was being rebuilt too, brick by brick, and we were caught in the middle of it, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide, and only each other to hold on to in the gathering storm. The decision to leave came not from fear, but from something simpler and more powerful, the realization that staying meant choosing survival over living, and I had already spent too many years just surviving. James found me an apartment across the city in the American sector, a small place above a bakery that smelled like yeast and sugar every morning. It was safer there, protected by military patrols and occupied by other civilians who worked for the Americans, people who had already made their peace with the new order and did not care who I loved or why. I packed my father's books and my mother's comb and the few clothes I owned, and I left the building on Bergstrasse in the middle of the night with James carrying my suitcase and his hand warm and steady on my back. Frau Müller watched us go from her window. I saw the curtain move, saw her pale face in the darkness, and I waited for her to call out, to alert the others, to bring Herr Koch and his friends down on us one last time. But she only looked, and then the curtain fell closed, and we disappeared into the June night like ghosts. The new apartment was bright and clean and nothing like home, but James brought me flowers for the windowsill and helped me arrange my father's books on the shelves, and slowly it became a place I could breathe. I found work at a hospital, translating medical documents from German to English for the American doctors who were helping to rebuild the healthcare system. It was not the same as my father's work, but it let me touch medicine again, let me be useful in a way that honored his memory. The head physician, a kind man from Boston named Dr. Sherman, asked no questions about my relationship with James. He simply welcomed me, taught me the American medical terminology I did not know, and told me I had a gift for making complicated things clear. James came to me every evening after his duties ended, and we would sit together by the window and watch the city slowly heal. We talked about everything and nothing. About his letter to Margaret, which he had finally sent, 3 pages of careful honesty that had taken him a week to write. About her response, which came a month later, cold and hurt and final. She would not contest the divorce, but she would not forgive him either, and she would make sure Thomas knew exactly why his father had chosen to abandon them. James read me that letter with tears in his eyes, and I held him while he grieved for the family he had lost and the son who might never understand. "I am sorry," I said. "I am so sorry I cost you this." "You did not cost me anything," he said fiercely. "I chose. Anna, I chose you, and I would choose you again, every time, even knowing what it would cost. But the cost was real, and it hurt him, I could see that." He wrote letters to Thomas every week, long letters full of love and explanation and hope that someday his son would read them and understand. He sent packages with American candy and small toys, though he never knew if they arrived or if Margaret threw them away unopened. He carried a photograph of Thomas in his wallet, and sometimes I would catch him looking at it with such longing on his face that I wanted to send him home. Wanted to tell him to go back and fix his marriage and forget about me. But I never did, because I was selfish too, because I needed him the way I needed air and light, and I could not make myself let him go. In September, his divorce became final. In October, he received orders transferring him to the American Zone headquarters in Frankfurt, a promotion that came with more responsibility and more time. We would have to move, but we would move together, and for the first time since this all began, we could do it openly, as a couple, without hiding or pretending or looking over our shoulders. The army still frowned on relationships with German civilians, but the rules were loosening, the old hatred giving way to pragmatism, and the simple reality that occupation meant contact, and contact meant connection, and connection sometimes meant love. We were married in November by an army chaplain who looked at me with suspicion, but performed the ceremony anyway because James outranked him and because the orders from above were clear. Integration, not isolation. Reconciliation, not revenge. The wedding was small, just us and Dr. Sherman and his wife as witnesses, and I wore a dress that Frau Weber had given me when I went back to collect the last of my things from the old apartment. She had hugged me tight and told me to be happy, to live the life my father would have wanted for me, and I had promised her I would try. James put a gold ring on my finger, and I became Anna Holloway, American by marriage, if not by birth, and we moved to Frankfurt and started building a life that felt impossible and miraculous in equal measure. I continued my translation work at the military hospital. James coordinated reconstruction projects and mediated disputes between German civilians and American authorities. We lived in officer housing with other military families who treated us with varying degrees of acceptance, some warm and welcoming, others cold and distant. I learned to ignore the whispers, the sidelong glances, the women who would not invite me to their coffee mornings because I was German and therefore suspect. I learned to hold my head high and to remember that I had survived worse than social exclusion. In the spring of 1947, I discovered I was pregnant. The news sent me into a panic that James could not immediately understand, but I made him listen while I explained. I was afraid, I told him. Afraid that I would not be a good mother because I had no model for it. My own mother having died when I was so young. Afraid that the baby would be rejected. Too German for the Americans and too American for the Germans. Afraid that I was bringing a child into a world that was still broken, still dangerous, still full of people who believed that love across enemy lines was a crime that deserved punishment. James took my face in his hands and made me look at him. Our child, he said slowly and clearly, will be born into a world where the war is over and people are learning to live together again. Our child will have a mother who understands suffering and chose compassion anyway, and a father who knows the price of hatred and chose love instead. Our child will have your father's legacy and my family's farm and a future that we build for them one day at a time. And that is enough. Anna, that is more than enough. Our daughter was born in December, small and red and furious, with dark hair like mine and James's winter sky eyes. We named her Clara, after my mother, and Margaret, after James's first wife, because he wanted his son to know that we had not forgotten her, that we honored what she had given him, even if the marriage had ended. I held Clara against my chest in the hospital bed and looked down at her tiny, perfect face, and I felt something shift inside me, some final piece of the war's damage falling away. This was new life. This was possibility. This was proof that the world could create beauty even after trying so hard to destroy it. Thomas never responded to James's letters. For years they went into the void, unanswered and perhaps unread, and I watched my husband carry that grief like a stone in his chest. But he never stopped writing. He told Thomas about Clara, about me, about the farm we bought outside Frankfurt, where we raised horses and grew vegetables and built a life that looked nothing like the one he had imagined, but was good and true and full of love anyway. He told Thomas that he understood if he was angry, that he hoped someday they might meet again and he could explain in person, that he would wait however long it took for his son to be ready. When Clara was 3, a letter finally came from Virginia, not from Thomas, but from James's brother, writing to say that Margaret had remarried, a good man who treated Thomas like his own son, and that the boy was doing well in school and seemed happy. The letter also said that Thomas had started asking questions about his real father, about why he had stayed in Germany, about the woman he had married. James's brother did not say whether Thomas's questions came from curiosity or anger, but he suggested that maybe, when Thomas was older, they might arrange a visit. Maybe it was not too late to build some kind of relationship, even if it could never be what it should have been. James wept when he read that letter, and I held him and our daughter, and we stood together in the farmhouse kitchen with late afternoon sun streaming through the windows, and we let ourselves hope. By 1950, Germany was changing again. The occupation was ending. The two zones were becoming two countries. The hatred was fading into something more complicated, more nuanced, a weary recognition that the war was over and life had to continue. And perhaps it was time to stop punishing each other for choices made in impossible circumstances. I still encountered prejudice, still heard whispers about the German woman who married an American, but increasingly I also encountered acceptance, friendship, even understanding. Frau Weber came to visit us once, making the long trip from Heidelberg with her daughter, and she sat in our garden and held Clara and told me how proud my father would have been to see what I had built from the ashes of his death. She told me that Herr Koch had moved away, that the building on Bergstrasse had been torn down to make room for new construction, that the cemetery where my father was buried now had a proper stone marker because the city had finally allocated funds for war memorial maintenance. She gave me a photograph of the stone, my father's name carved in granite now instead of wood, permanent and real, and I cried looking at it because it meant he had not been forgotten, that his mercy had been worth something after all. James retired from the army in 1952, and we stayed in Germany because it had become home. We expanded the farm. We raised horses and Clara and eventually 2 more children, a son we named Klaus after my father, and a daughter we named Grace, because that was what we wanted her to have, what we wanted all our children to have, the grace to live in a world that their parents' generation had nearly destroyed. We became part of the community, no longer occupiers or occupied, but simply people trying to make a life in complicated times. Thomas came to visit in 1955. He was 17, almost a man, and he looked so much like his father that my breath caught when I opened the door and saw him standing there. He was cautious with James, formal and careful, but he was kind to me and gentle with his half-siblings, and over the course of that 2-week visit, I watched some of the walls between him and his father start to come down. They walked the farm together. They talked about the war, about choices and consequences, and the messy reality of being human. They did not resolve everything. They did not suddenly become the father and son they might have been if James had never met me. But they began. They found a starting place. And that was enough. On Thomas's last evening with us, we all went to Heidelberg, to the cemetery where my father was buried. I had not been back in years, had not been able to face it, but with James beside me and all the children gathered around, I finally felt strong enough. We stood at the granite marker, and I told them the whole story, about the night my father saved an enemy soldier's life, and how that one act of mercy had led to all of this. To their father meeting me, to their existence, to the family we had become against all odds and all logic. Clara, who was 8 and solemn and wise beyond her years, put her small hand on the stone and said, "He was a good man, your papa." "Yes," I said, "he was the best man I ever knew, until I met your father." James took my hand and we stood together at the grave, and I felt the weight of all the years between that first Sunday when I saw 10 American soldiers standing in formation, and this moment when I stood with my family and my heart full and my father's legacy alive in the choices my children would make. The war had tried to kill everything. It had tried to destroy mercy and compassion and the possibility of love between enemies. But it had failed. We had survived. We had chosen each other. We had built something beautiful from the rubble. That night, back at the farm, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, James and I sat on the porch and looked out at the dark fields and the stars overhead. I thought about the wildflowers I had dropped on my father's grave that first Sunday, how they had scattered across the earth like promises. I thought about all the promises we had made since then, to each other, to our children, to the future. I thought about the ring on my finger and the life we had built and the impossible journey that had brought us here. "Do you have regrets?" I asked James. "About any of it? About choosing me instead of the life you had before?" He was quiet for a long moment, and then he pulled me close and kissed the top of my head. "Every choice costs something," he said. "And yes, I grieve what I lost. I grieve the years I missed with Thomas. I grieve the pain I caused Margaret. But regret? No. Anna, loving you was the first truly brave thing I ever did. Braver than landing at Normandy. Braver than facing enemy fire. Because it meant choosing hope over hate, future over past, possibility over safety. Your father taught me that when he saved my life. You taught me what it meant when you let me love you anyway. I would make the same choice 1,000 times over." I leaned into him and let myself believe it, and overhead the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to our small human dramas. But we were not indifferent. We had lived through the worst the world could do, and we had chosen each other anyway, and that choice had mattered. It had built a family. It had created love where there should have been only ashes. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. The war had tried to decide who we could love and how and why. It had drawn lines and demanded we stay on our assigned sides and punished anyone who dared to cross over. But love, I had learned, does not respect lines. It grows where it will, stubborn as spring, and no amount of hatred can kill it permanently. You can bury it under rubble and grief and guilt, but if you give it even the smallest chance, it will push through again, green and impossible and true. My father had known that. He had lived it. And in saving James, he had given me the chance to learn it too. To understand that mercy is not weakness, but the hardest kind of strength. That choosing love over hate, especially when hate is easier, is the only thing that redeems us in the end. That the war may have circled my father's grave with soldiers, but what grew from that circle was not death, but life, not ending but beginning, not division but connection that proved stronger than all the forces trying to tear us apart. I am Anna Holloway, and I chose love. My father would have been proud.